In this video, we're going to get a crash course on using Amazon Sumerian by building an application that's useful for training and education. We'll be using a 3D virtual model of an industrial-size air compressor. We will then create a scene that uses this air compressor that allows users to learn more about the air compressor, interact with the air compressor, and at the very end, we will add virtual reality or VR capabilities. In this section, we'll be setting up a large room to be our environment. We will add a box that will act as our large room. We will then add some custom branding, and then we'll add some textures for the floors. All right, let's start off by starting in the AWS Management Console. You're first going to want to find Amazon Sumerian, and you see that I've recently visited Amazon Alexa and Sumerian both. If you scroll down to the AR/VR section, you could find Amazon Sumerian. So you could always find it from these lists of services. Lots of services. It's growing all the time. You can also just search for it, and if you do that, you can just click on it, and it'll go right to it. All right. So from the AWS console, this is going to take us into the dashboard. This is the dashboard. If you're brand new to Sumerian, this will look a little bit different because you won't have any previously created scenes. There are some templates down here, and yeah, there's several different things we can use. And you won't have any of these scenes, of course. You have your drafts, which you click on that, and it lists all the different drafts. Trash, of course, things that you've deleted. Projects are really groups of scenes, and shared projects are projects and scenes that are shared within IAM accounts. All right, so let's go back to home and create a new scene. And we're going to call this the air compressor. Actually, no, let's call this crash course. There we go. All right, so let's click create. I sometimes switch between using my trackpad and my mouse. Both work, I should say, but using a mouse is actually a lot easier to use. I also am working on a Mac, and so using the scroll wheel to zoom in and out is a little bit, it's not as good if you have a mouse with an actual scroll wheel, just as a heads up. So sometimes you kind of get jumped around a little bit using the Magic Mouse for a Mac. All right, so as you can see, we are here in the Sumerian editor. And you notice that over in the Indies panel, well, let's just walk through some of the different sections here. There are several tutorials we have that will walk you through all these different parts. And so we have lots of different things, but I'll just quickly run through that. First, here in the middle is called the canvas. Some people call it the viewport, but really it is the 3D. It's the 3D view of your scene. It's the canvas. It's where you're actually creating your environment. So we have a grid in here, and we just have a gray black background. If you zoom out, you'll see that there are two different lights here in this scene, and that's because if you see default dynamic lights over here, if I click on them, then they are selected. I'm not going to go over the different light types in this tutorial, but you can add more lights, and you can move them around and change the direction and the angle and all that. All right, so that's really all we have in our scene, and the default camera, which is the camera that I'm currently viewing my scene with. If I collapse this node or this component up here and go down to the camera component, you see that I have the default camera selected as my main camera, and it's also following the editor camera. So following the editor camera means that wherever your camera stops, in editor mode, when you press play to test out your scene, that is where your camera is going to be. So it's actually following. If you unselect this, check this out, then you see how my camera just sticks there. So when I press play, it will jump to that spot. When I press stop, it'll go back to where the editor camera is. So the editor camera can be separate from the camera in your scene. If you select that, then there it is. Doesn't really matter so much. Okay, let's talk about the entities panel. The entities panel is the list of everything that is inside your scene. If you select the top or root entity, you notice this is crash course. This is the name of the scene that I created. If I select the top component or node over here in the inspector panel. I can change the name, I can give it a description, add tags and custom attributes, which is beyond the scope of this course. AWS configuration we will get to a little bit later. And this is how you actually connect in with other AWS services. That is something we will do when we get to the Amazon Alex portion of this video. And there's other things here. Snapshots is like taking versions of your scene. And anyways, we're not going to cover all of that. But that is the entities panel. If you select different, if you notice that as you select different entities in the entities panel, the inspector panel changes based on what you have selected. So if I have the default camera selected, I have a camera component, it has a script component. And if I select lights, you see how they have a light component. And if you want to add more components, you can just select add component and select things like state machine, which we will get to later in the video. All right, in this assets panel, the assets panel really holds everything that is in your scene and that makes up the entirety of your entities. We will look more at the assets panel a little bit later as it becomes more important to use. And we already clicked some of these buttons. If you press play, then it goes into play mode. Nothing is happening in our scene, so there's really nothing to really preview at the moment. So press stop. You can turn on and off the grid up here, but it's better to keep the grid on to have a sense of context, 3D context. And let's see, anything else we want to cover right now? Scene drop-down menu. If you want to save it real quickly, if you want to duplicate, look at recent scenes. Tools. This takes you to the text editor, state machine editor, and the timeline editor. We will be looking at the text. We'll not be looking at the text editor. We will be looking at the state machine editor quite a bit later. All right, so let's get started. In this section, what we want to do is create a room with a few different things. So we want to set up some sort of environment, some sort of 3D environment. So I'm going to be going through this quickly, so if you need to pause, feel free to do so. I'm going to click Create Entity up here above the canvas, and I'm just going to select a box. If I select the F key, you notice how it was zoomed way out. If I select the F key, it'll frame that entity that I've selected, which is box right now. It'll frame it in the middle of the canvas. Let's change this. So I'm just going to double click over here in the entities panel. I could also go to the top level or the details component over here in the inspector panel and change the name. But this is an easier way to do it. I'm just going to call this room. Okay, so we're going to call it room. We are going to, if we click on the transform, everything has a transform because everything in the 3D environment will have some sort of position. And transform is the position of your entity within your scene. It will have some sort of location. Sorry, I keep hitting the volume button on my headphones, so I'll move that out of the way. Okay, it'll have some sort of position, it'll have a scale, it'll have a rotation. Right now it's set to 0, but we're going to change that. Because we want this to be a room, we're going to make it 20. And if we zoom out, then you'll see our box has gotten a lot bigger. Just as a note, when you jump into VR, which we will be doing later in the video, 1 unit equates to about 1 meter. And so, we're going to make in the room about 20 meters cubed. We also want to move it up a little bit. So there are a few different ways that you can move entities around. First of all, if you see these handles, also called gizmos, you can grab them and move them up. And as you do, notice how the value changes over in the inspector panel, over in your transform values. So if I want to get it exact though, say I want to move this up to 10, then it'll be exact. So the bottom of the box or our room will be level with the 0 plane in our scene or the grid. All right, now here's the thing. This is the way a lot of entities work. If I zoom inside, I can't see from the inside out. I see kind of the outline of the box, but I can't see it. So to change that, what I need to do is I'll collapse the transform for the moment. I'll go to material. I'll scroll down all the way to culling, and under culling, you see cull face is back. That's basically saying that you are viewing the back of the box, or in this case, the outside of the box. If I select that and I go front, then it flips it so that it'll always render the inside or the front face of the box. So now that I'm inside the box, I can see outside. But if I'm outside the box, I can see into it, which is what we want for this particular demo. Okay. All right, so we have a box, but we want to change the color because gray is kind of boring. So let's select material again, and if you just go to the top level property, I shouldn't say top level, the top property, color diffuse, and I select the color picker, we can go to something more like that. Sure, it's a nice color blue. That'll work. All right, so we have added some color properties. If you notice, there's no light coming in on this side. So I don't want that. Well, maybe I'll leave it now. We'll see what it looks like. We might add another light because you can see this side is not lit at all. So we might add another light to get some light there. Okay, as we said at the beginning of this section, we want to add some branding. And to do that, we're just going to add a simple create entity again and a simple quad. And we're going to rename this, pic. We're just going to add a picture. You can't see it from the back. See, this is that culling kicking in. So we'll zoom out here. We'll raise it up. And I'll go to my transform. I will move it, flip around this way. So rotate it 90 degrees. See how I'm doing a combination of the handles and the transform values directly. Let's move it along the Z-axis. I guess X-axis. Let's go 10 units. Oops, the other way. I guess it'll be negative 10 units. Okay. But then it's in the same place as the box. So I'll just bring it out just a little bit. And I want to make it quite a bit bigger. Well, we'll actually deal with that in a minute. So I have a quad. Now I want to add some sort of picture on there. I'm just going to go to Browse, and I have, where is it? Air compressor demo, and we'll just do the Sumerian logo. We'll add it on there, but it's going to be, the quad is squished, as you can see. So, and I want to make it a lot bigger. So I go back to my transform. I'll zoom out again. And I'm just doing this by, right now I've selected uniform scale. So if I change one of these values, they're all going to change. I'm going to now unselect uniform scale because the image is not actually square. All right, I'm also going to change the color text because I have the image on there, but it still has a tinted color of this darker gray. So I'm going to bring that, and I'm also going to go down to specular, and I'm going to lighten that up. And emissive, we're going to bring up all the way. Okay. All right, so now we have some special branding. Now we also want to add some texture to the floors, and so this is going to be really similar. We're going to add another quad, and we're going to call it floor. We're going to rotate this by negative 90 degrees. Just bring it up just a hair. And we want to do the uniform scale by 20, so it's the same. All right, so now we have a floor, but we want to add a unique texture. If you go to import assets, you notice there are a bunch of different assets. There's lots of hosts, which we are not going to get really into in this video. There are several videos that do cover that. We're going to scroll down to, what are we looking for? We're looking for some tile textures. Here we go. Let's do concrete because we're trying to make it sort of like a warehouse. So we'll select material concrete. So really what we are looking at here, this is the asset library. So there's a lot of different available assets. So lots of different materials you can use, the hosts you can use. If you scroll all the way down, there's a lot of 360-degree images you can use. There's also a few random pieces of furniture that can be useful. But we just are going to use the material concrete asset pack. And so what this will do, this will bring in a bunch of different textures, which are really just JPEG images, into our assets panel. So now that it's in the assets panel, what I want to do is take, let's just say concrete 2, and you see how it says concrete 2 underscore diff. That means diffuse, so that's where this one belongs. And let's also do concrete 2 norm. So we'll add that to the normal property. And then there's one more specular, concrete 2 specular. We're not going to get into all the differences of what this concrete is. Okay, so now we have a concrete floor. But look, as we get really close to the concrete floor, it looks not quite right. See, it looks like it's too big, right? So in order to kind of, instead of stretch this over the bottom of our large room, we want to repeat it. So really shrink down the size of this material and then repeat it so it's not so large. Because this doesn't, once you get really close, this doesn't really look like concrete. It looks more like the moon or something. And so let's go to our color diffuse and see the pencil icon, the edit icon. So I'm going to click this to get into the properties of the actual texture itself. And you see the repeat U. We're going to change the repeat U to 20 and the repeat V to 20. And now it looks more like concrete. Getting down nice and close to it. Yeah, I mean you could even do it more than 20. You can do as much as you want. Let's just see. I'm just curious. I've not actually done this. So we'll go to normal and do the same thing. Doesn't really seem to change too much. Okay. All right, so now we have a concrete floor, we have some branding, and we have a room. In this section, we'll be importing the 3D model of our air compressor. Included in the description of this video is a link to the 3D model or the air compressor that we're going to be using. If you elect to not use this air compressor or purchase this model, then you can also use 3D primitives available for free inside Amazon Sumerian, and we'll also show you how to do that. All right, so let's go ahead and add in our air compressor. Let me actually first, before we do that, let me show you which one we're using. So if you go to TurboSquid, this is where you can find it. Not super expensive, and you can download it, and it'll work just fine. But you don't have to use this. You can. I will show you how to use just a box, or even if you just use a box instead, it will still work just the same. This will make it just look a little bit more interesting. Because if we go back to Sumerian, let's go ahead and go to our assets panel. And if I open up my compressor underscore OBJ, I will highlight all of these and open all of them at the same time. That'll bring it into the assets panel. And once it's in the assets panel, notice there are several different types of assets here. The one we're going to want to bring into our scene, and this is pretty much true with anything, when you're bringing anything into your scene, you're always going to look for this hexagon icon, which is the entities. So it needs to be an entity. See how everything kind of has most of them have a hexagon icon next to it. It means it is an entity, and if we bring it into our scene, there it is. If I select the F key, it frames it up a little bit better. Okay, so here we go. And you see how it's kind of, remember how I brought that texture floor up a little bit? So it is just raised up a little bit. So I got to raise it up. And once you see it kind of start dipping down there. Okay, here we go. Got our air compressor. Now again, if you didn't want to buy this, or you wanted to just complete this video course without buying it, that is totally fine. All you got to do is go to Create Entity. You really can select any one of these. If we just select a box, if you even want to make it roughly the same. One thing I didn't mention before is that for the transform values, you can also change what transform handles you have. I've been using the translation. That is the actual position. So if I move it around, that's translation. If I select scale here, you see how the handles change a little bit, and I can change the scale by making it a little bit bigger, taller. So you can do the same thing and complete this video with doing just using the box instead. That is totally fine. I just wanted to demonstrate how you can use large machinery, okay? So all the same things would still apply if you use the box. I'm gonna go ahead and delete this because I don't want it. I'll click delete up here, then click yes. And then my box is deleted. In this section, we'll be using the state machine to create two behaviors that will allow us to interact with our 3D model. We will be able to point and click at the air compressor, causing it to scale up and down in size. Be aware that we will be setting up these behaviors in a way that will allow us to use VR later in the video. All right, in this section, we need to create a couple behaviors that will allow us to grow and shrink, or scale or in size, increase, decrease the size of our object. And this will become a lot more interesting when you're in VR, because this is roughly a meter high or something. So when you're in VR, it's waist level-ish. But then we want to be able to click on it and have it grow, and we will eventually be able to walk around it to inspect it a little bit more. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to create two behaviors that will allow us to click on it, and then it will grow and shrink in size. All right, now remember how we said just a second ago that we are going to be creating these behaviors in a way that will allow us to use VR later. So if you're wondering why, there are different ways to do this, but I'm just kind of planning ahead for what we eventually will want to do later in the video. All right, let's go ahead and just change this name here. And we will call it air compressor. Compressor, that's how you spell it. Okay, so now we have air compressor up here. If you expand it, you see how there's then the compressor, and then there's a few other things. So it creates a few different entities that are parented under one another, which we will actually be sort of using here in a little bit. All right, but now that we have the air compressor selected, what we want to do is go over to the inspector panel, add a component, and we're going to go add the state machine component. We don't have any behaviors. No behaviors are in the component. So to create a new behavior, you just press the plus button, and this will take us into the state machine editor. And we're going to spend a lot of our time here in the rest of the video. Okay, so the state machine is really the component or the editor, the machine that will allow us to add behaviors and interactivity to our scene. So in this case, we want to be able to click on it either with our cursor or with our VR controller once we have VR capabilities, and then have it grow and shrink. Fairly simple to do enough, but that is what has to happen. Like right now, they're just like static models that don't do anything. So if we want to have some sort of be able to interact with things and have things behave in such a way and react to user input, that's when we're going to use the state machine. All right, so over here in the state machine, the inspector panel, you see I'll have, we're going to have several different behaviors, so it's really important to name your behaviors. So we're going to call this one click behavior. You can name it whatever you want, but it's not going to make a difference to the performance of your behavior. All right, and then you see how I have one state, meaning it's well, I'm not going to explain it right now. It'll make more sense once we kind of get into it. I'm going to change the name of this state from state 1 to click. And I'm going to add an action. So we have a state, and it's named, but it has no action on it. So I got to click add action. There's a bunch of different actions. You should explore all these different actions. And you see how there's different categories. I know what I want, so I'm just going to search for it, click, and then it's going to be click/tap on entity. So click being if you're using a desktop computer or a laptop. Tap being if you're in a mobile device. So if you tap on your screen, it'll act the same. I'm going to move the get rid of these two panels over here by clicking that hide button. And then I will add state to add another state. I don't want it to be state 1. I'm just going to call this one emit. I'll explain what this is in a second. I will then click add action and search for emit. Emit message. Let's just read what it says. Emits a message to a channel on the bus. Messages can be listened to by the listen action or by scripts using the system bus, so forth. I'm not going to read all that. So I'll click add. So what is this saying? Essentially, when the state machine goes to this state, it's going to emit a message or a channel, and we can define it to be whatever we want. So I'm just going to call this one clicked. I'll just call it clicked. All right, so, and that's all we need it to be. But if you notice, well, let's think about this. Let's move these over. So now I'm going to add a transition from click to emit, so that when I click on it, you see how it transitions. And that message was emitted. There's no other behavior doing anything with that message yet, which we will do in a second. But you notice how I want to be able to click on it multiple times. So I want to be able to, so every time I click on it, I want it to be able to emit that message. But it can't return to this click state because I don't have a way to transition back to it. It's a very simple fix. All you do is click add action and search for transition. And it's just transitions to a selected state. So now we have this, what's called transition label down below, where I can pull another transition back. So that when you're not even really going to see it. I'm clicking on it and it is transitioning, but it's just doing it so fast that it doesn't actually get to even highlight the emit message. But every time I click on this, and I'm doing that a bunch right now, if you hear my mouse, and it's emitting that message, clicked. Okay. So now we have a behavior that is allowing us to click on the machine or the air compressor and then emit a message. We also now need to add a state machine that will then listen to that message and then scale the air compressor larger and smaller. So I'm going to click the plus button again on the state machine, let me back up just if I did that too fast. I had my air compressor selected. Under state machine, I clicked the plus button. I don't want to do it again because I already did just create a behavior. So I'm going to now go back to, see how it just says behavior? I'm just going to click the edit button. And we're back same place. I'm going to call this one scale behavior. Now, if you think about it, how should this behavior be started, or what should be the initial state for this behavior? It's important to think if something is being emitted, you need something to listen. So I'm going to call it listen, and then click add action, and we'll search for listen, not DOM event listener. We need just listen. And this is going to listen for that message. We'll call it clicked. And then it can transition to something once it hears that message. I will add state. And I will call this one scale up. I will add an action. And I will look for the tween scale action. All right, what is tween? Tween stands for in between. So it's going to show you the initial state and how it changes from the initial state to these. I don't mean states by these, by its initial scale to the next scale, and it's gonna you can control the time it takes to get there. So it's really creating some sort of animation. So it's right now. I'll just give this a shot. Let's do 3 by 3 by 3. We're not going to do relative. Time is 1 second. That's probably fine. And then easing type. Let's just see how this looks. Let's not change the easing type of direction for a second and just see what it looks like. If I click on it, okay. But you see how there wasn't like it just drew from one scale to another scale. The easing type will allow it to just look a little bit more interesting. So we're going to go quadratic in and out. Let's just see how that looks. See how it kind of has like speeds up and slows down. Just adds a little bit more interesting look to it. Okay, great. Now we want to be able to click on it again and then have it shrink back down in size. So what we're going to do is, instead of adding a new state, I'm just going to click the listen and then duplicate this state. And it can be, we want it to be listening for the same message, so we'll leave that. And then the scale up, I'm going to duplicate that, bring it down here. I'm going to change the name to scale down, and we're going to change the values to 1, 1, 1. You can change the easing type if you want. But instead of having to listen, because I duplicated it, goes back to the scale up, I'll just change it to scale down, and I'll just complete all these. So now when I press play, if I click on it, it'll increase in size. See how it's listening again now? And it'll go back to its size of 1, 1, 1. So I click. So every time I click on it, a message is emitted, and this behavior is then listening for that same message all the time, and every time it does, it's transitioning either to be scale up, or scale down. If you try to click it while it's still growing, then it won't do anything because it's not yet listening for that message yet. So you got to wait till it is completely large or small. Okay, and that completes the basic behavior portion of this video using the state machine. In this section, we will use the dialog component that will allow us to use a chatbot created in Amazon Lex. We will then use the state machine to create another behavior that will allow us to interact with our chatbot. All right, so far we have an air compressor that, and once we get into VR, it'll make a little more sense that when you jump into the scene, you can walk around or teleport around this machine and then click on it to have it grow and shrink, and you can walk around it and learn about it and all sorts of things. So, of course, you could add different behaviors, but this is just a basic behavior of growing and shrinking in size. But we also want to add the ability to ask questions or learn more about verbally about this state machine. Okay, so one thing we need to do is add just a basic entity. A lot of times people use hosts, so there's virtual hosts. We're not going to get into the hosts. We're really just going to talk about how to use a chatbot without a host. So you could do this just as easily with a host. Check out some of our videos that use hosts, but we're just going to be using the chatbot without a host in this particular video. So I'm creating an empty entity, and I'm calling this one chatbot. An empty entity, it has nothing in it. It's empty. Okay, so we need to add a few components. First, we need to add a dialog component. Next, we need to add a speech component. And we will actually need to add a state machine component as well. Okay, so we have a few different things here. I'm going to click on the Open AWS console, but it gives me this error message. See, it really can't connect me to my AWS account because we haven't inserted a Cognito Identity Pool ID. So to do that, I'm going to go to our documentation section, and I'm going to look at this, the Amazon Cognito setup using AWS Cloud Formation. What you're going to want to do is go down to the template you want to use and launch the stack. We want to do the Amazon Poly and Amazon Lex stack. So if you go through this tutorial, it's really simple, and it'll eventually give you a Cognito Identity Pool ID that we will then add into our Sumerian scene, which I'll show you. I'm not going to complete this tutorial in this video. This is something you can pause this one and go ahead and complete this. It just takes a couple minutes, so it's pretty quick. Once you're back into Sumerian, what you're going to want to do is click on your top level entity, the name of your scene, and then under AWS configuration, I'm going to insert your Cognito Identity Pool ID. Remember, this is important to not share too broadly because it will give people access to a lot of resources in your account. So now, let's go back to our chatbot. And if we open the AWS console, it will actually allow me to open up the AWS console because it is basically granting Sumerian permission to reach out to this Amazon Lex account or console. I've already created a Lex bot, and we're not going to walk you through how to do it. I will just quickly show you what it is. This is something you can do by yourself. It's pretty easy. So without going into too much detail about Lex, essentially there are several different intents. We'll just, in this particular case, we'll just think of them as questions. So for example, I'm going to go down to here to this what is. If you notice, the sample utterance is what is this? I want to learn more about air compressors. Tell me about air compressors. What is an air compressor? So I can ask any of these questions, and there will be just a response that gives me a definition. And just to be completely honest, I don't know much about air compressors. I just pulled these from Wikipedia. So this is just answers that I just got offline. So describing what an air compressor is and what it does and so forth. Okay, so to test this chatbot, well, to make sure that if you want to build some intents, you can press intent, create an intent, and then add in some sample utterances that you want to do, and then you would go down to response and click a response. And this is just a very simple Q&A chatbot. If you want to actually have some more interactive chatbot, there's a lot more you can do. This one's a very simple one, just being what is asking a question and then providing an answer. And so, for example, when I say, and I'm going to test this, what is this? There we go, give it the answer. All right. And then I'll ask, what is PSI? What is PSI? Because I think because I didn't actually, these aren't spaced, it just looked at what is and then gave me the same air compressor. But if I space it out, then it gives me the correct PSI answer. All right, so I know that it's working. I saved it, I built it, and I published it. And really the only thing I need from Lex is this, just the name of my Lex bot. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to go ahead and return to the Sumerian console, and under bot name, air compressor. When you do publish your bot, it'll make you create an alias. So you can call it whatever you want, but if you just type in here latest, it'll pull the latest alias. So no matter what you created your alias to be, using this value here will just pull the latest alias. All right, under speech, this is integrating directly with Amazon Polly, and so you can change the voice, the volume, and so forth. We're not going to get into speeches in this, but you can create special speeches. So if you wanted to say something, when you enter into the scene, you can do that. We're not going to worry about it in this video, but now we're going to create a state machine that will allow us to interact with the chatbot. Okay, so let's go ahead and create behavior. We're going to call this one chat behavior. Let's hide those panels. I'm going to run through this kind of quickly, and then I will explain what it is. So if you need to pause as I go along, feel free to do so. So we're going to call this one AWS SDK. I'm going to add action, and I'm going to look for AWS SDK. If you read what it says, performs a transition when the AWS SDK has been initialized and is ready for use. Essentially, if you're using other services in AWS, it's good to set up to start off your state machines using this AWS SDK. All right, we'll go to state 1. And we will call this one wait. We will call this one key down. And we will look for the key down action. And this is pretty simple. It's just when you press, you can specify which key you want it to be. I'll have it be the space bar. And once that space bar is clicked, it will then transition to another state, which I will create another state. And I will call this record. I'll call it start recording. We will click add action. And start microphone recording is one we want. If you notice, there's no transition here, so I can't continue on without having another action. So I'll add another action, and essentially we will do the key up. And because we have the key up, it'll then transition to the next state. Again, I'll stop and explain this in a minute. We'll call this one stop recording. And we'll look for stop microphone recording. And then once it stops the microphone recording, it will then transition to another state, which we will call process with Lex. We will add action and call it actually send audio input to dialogbot. If you want to do text, you can. We have a tutorial for that. And so you can feel free to do that way if you want. We're just going to do audio in this one. So we're going to send audio input to dialogbot. And okay, what else do we want? We need to add one more state. This is our last state, and we will call this one start speech. and we will look for start speech here. Starts a speech with text or SSML file. This is the same one if you created your own speech file, if you just wanted a host or if you wanted a host or if you wanted your speech component to just start saying something, you would do this one. But here you notice how you can select a speech if we've created one. We have not. We're using Lex, and so we will use Lex response. And then we're going to tie all these states together with transitions. Make sure when you're going from process with Lex, you're transitioning from the on response ready. You could do also on response error or on response or on Lex configuration error. We don't really need any of those, but just make sure that you're pulling from on response ready. And then once the speech is done, we want to be able to interact with it again, and so we will go to that one. All right. One thing I forgot to mention for the other state machines is that you can change what is your initial state. So when you go into your scene or your scene starts up, what is going to be the initial state? So for this one, we want AWS SDK. It's already set as the initial state, but say I wanted to switch that, I would select it and then select this one is set as the initial state. It's not what we want, and so set that one as initial state. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're going through these, that if you accidentally change which one is the initial state, that might solve a problem if you're running into one. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. One thing to note is that at the making of this video, there is a known issue that these key down actions sometimes conflict with using Google Chrome. And so I'm switching real quickly to Firefox just to avoid that issue. So I'm going to go press the play button. It's going to ask me if I want to use which microphone. I'm using this nice microphone, the Scarlett. Well, it is a nice microphone, but I'm using a different, not the external microphone. I'm using a specific one. So I'm going to select this one and then click allow. And saying, okay, Firefox wants to access my microphone. Okay, and you can see that it's working by this microphone icon. Okay, so it's now waiting for me to press the key down. Once I press the key down, it will start recording and I can ask a question. What is an air compressor? Something happened here. What happened was the space bar was the one I used for key down, and then I didn't change it for the key up. Actually, I didn't change it to space bar. So let's try that again. What is an air compressor?
An air compressor is a device that converts power, using an electric motor, diesel or gasoline engine, into potential energy stored in pressurized air. By one of several methods, an air compressor forces more and more air into a storage tank, increasing the pressure.
All right, quite a long answer. And there we go. Okay, so, and of course you can go through and ask all the different Q&A questions you want. I'm not going to do that because we get the point. You see, so we're actually getting a quick Q&A. But now, for this set up this way would not necessarily work for VR, because depending on your VR headset, do you have a microphone in your VR headset? So there's a lot of different things depending on your hardware with VR that you would have to think about. So this chatbot will currently only work for your desktop setup. So just something to keep in mind. All right, I'm going to go ahead and stop, and we're going to close this one out. We're going to be done with the Lexbot. We're not going to return to it again. But that is how you create a chatbot using Amazon Lex, Amazon Polly, because the voices have to come from somewhere, and Amazon Sumerian. In this section, we will add information annotations to our scene. This will allow us to click on various components of the air compressor to populate info cards. All right, in this part, we're going to add some annotations, hot spots, and so when we hover with our mouse or our controllers, we'll enable that a little bit later in VR, we will get some annotated info cards. We're just going to do lorem ipsum and, nothing actually informative, but we're just going to show you how to actually do that. Okay, so first of all, we need to create a few different entities. So this is going to be a little bit of a longer section. We're going to first create another entity, and we're going to create a sphere. The sphere is oops, not that. I want the sphere. All right, and I'm going to change the material color. I'm just using a sphere. You could use whatever you want to be your hotspot. And I'm going to put the hotspot. Say I want to learn something about this valve. I'm going to move it over here. And let's move the transform down to 0.2. How about 0.1? Oops. Here we go. All right, let's move it down. A little bit closer to the valve. So we're going to call this one the valve hotspot. Okay, and we're gonna nest this underneath the air compressor. This is kind of important for the hierarchy structure. I'm not going to get into why this is important, but we do need, well, the main reason why I'm not going to go into great detail about why this is important, but the main thing to think about is that when this scales, when I click on the whole machine or the whole air compressor, I want the hotspots to scale with it. If it's not nested underneath the air compressor, it'll just remain in the same space and remain at the same scale, which is not exactly what we want. So I need that to be there. So I'm going to then create another hotspot, but I'm going to call this one motor. That's not what I wanted to do. Motor hotspot. The motor hotspot, I duplicated it. Maybe I did that too fast. I clicked on valve hotspot. I clicked the duplicate button. So it's actually sitting in the same spot as the first one. So if I move it out, then you'll see that we have two. And this may or may not even be a motor. I'm not sure. Again, not the important part. Oh, shoot. We did the wrong one. I want the valve to stay near the valve, and I want the motor to be over close to what looks to maybe be a motor. Okay, great. All right, so we have these two hotspots. Now we need to add some annotation cards to be displayed, right? So what we need to do is we need to create an entity. We will create a quad, and just like we did before with the branding and the logo and the floor, we're just going to rotate this to be over here somewhat. Looks like I need to add an extra light. I'll do that in a second. Okay, I already have created a texture that will work for this. So if I click on it and I go into here, I'm going to do my blue card. So see, nothing actually on it. And let's lighten this up. And missive will bring up as well. I might not actually need to add a light. If I added a light, this would actually probably be really washed out. But either way, it's fine like this. And I'm just going to put it there. Okay. Great. I'm going to create another entity and do the same thing with another card. And put it over this second hotspot. And I forgot to change the name and also nest it, so I need to do that too with the first one. One thing to note is that I'm using textures for these info cards. You could use HTML. There are some reasons why HTML is not always consistently compatible with VR, and so there are good reasons to use HTML so you can update it dynamically. But we're just going to use just images for this particular video, and I'm going to select the gray card for this one. And again, we're going to change these values here to lighten it up a bit. If you do add more lights, again, and it looks really washed out, then you might need to go change your emissive values. Okay, so we have our info cards. We didn't actually name them, so I'm going to call this one valve card. And I need to nest that also, nesting by dragging and dropping, if I can get it there. All right, and then quad 2, same thing. We'll call it motor card. Oh, come on. Go in there. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm doing the wrong one, not the air compressor. Okay, so we have the motor card, motor hotspot, valve card, valve hotspot. So now let's add some state machine actions that will then allow us to, we're going to use hover over these hotspots to display these info cards. So what we're going to do is really similar to that click action, so that when we hover over this, it'll emit a message. The card will listen to that message to then show itself and then hide itself, each one. Okay, so let's start with the valve hotspot. We'll add component, we'll add state machine, we'll add a new state machine behavior, and we'll call this one valve hover. For this first state, we'll call it hover enter, and we will look for the hover enter action. There's a hover exit. We'll use that one next. And we will add a state. And we're going to be using emit. And we will look for the emit message action. And channel, we will call this one valve on. I'm going to go and duplicate the hover enter. And we'll call it hover exit. And I'm going to look for the hover exit. So meaning hover when I exit it. So I have hover enter and hover exit. I'm just going to get rid of the hover exit. One thing that we have noticed also is that sometimes it's a better idea to use the under the hover exit or enter accuracy to do the slow instead of the bounding fast. I did forget to put a transition action on my emit. So there we go. So now we have a hover enter. It'll transition to an emit. The message valve on, and it will transition to the hover exit. So when I move my cursor or my mouse off of it, it will now emit another message. So instead of valve on, it'll be valve off. It's important to change these messages. If you don't change these messages, then it won't work. Okay, so now I've made it go into clockwise fashion. So hover enter. So let's just see it work. Okay, it's going too fast to actually highlight the emit message, but it is emitting those valve on, valve off messages. All right, so it's working. Great. We now want to go to our valve card and add a component, state machine, and we will call this the valve card behavior. All right. If you're using an emit message somewhere, you're going to be needing a listen message. So we'll call this one listen. We'll click add action and add the listen message. We'll click add state. And we're going to call this one tween. Oh, actually, we'll just do opacity on. All right, and then we will look for the tween opacity, tween material opacity. And we want to turn it on, and we want it to go to an opacity of 1, that it means fully on. Time, we want it to be just 0.5 seconds, so that is okay. I want to duplicate that listen message again. I didn't actually add a message here. Going a little out of order. Okay, so for the first listen message, we're going to do we're listening for valve on. Remember that, oh my goodness, it is case sensitive, so that is something to make sure that it all matches correctly. And then this one will be valve off. Okay, so our first listen message is listening for valve on. It'll transition to opacity on to turn on or show the card. It'll then transition to be listening for the valve off message, which will then transition to, we'll duplicate this opacity on, instead call it opacity off, and we'll change the opacity to 0. And then we'll add all these transitions in here. Okay, so, but we have a problem. It's already on. So how do we get it to turn off from the get-go when we start our scene? Pretty simple. I'm just going to select my opacity off action or state, and I'm going to make this one my initial state. So when it first starts the scene, it'll be turned off, but we actually don't want it to take any time. We just want it to be 0 seconds. So check it out. So now when we press play, see, it immediately turned it off, and now it's listening. And because it doesn't transition back to this one, it won't ever go back to that state. So now when I hover on, and you see how it listens. If I hover on, hover off really quickly, so I hovered off before it started listening for the hover off message, the message that was emitted by the hover off. So now I got to hover on again and then hover off. So if you're hovering on and off too fast, you might need to go back to hover on and off. Okay, so that's how that one works, and it's working the way we want. Great. The other thing is that we need to add make some very similar behaviors for the motor card. But instead of starting from scratch, we can make it do this really simple by going to the assets panel, and you see this behavior icon or filter button. So we filter to all our behaviors. Let's go to our valve hover, and we're just going to duplicate it. So now we have a valve hover 2 action, and I'm just going to change it to motor hover. But we do need to make some changes to the emitted messages. So instead of valve on, we're going to call it motor on. Instead, for this second emit action, instead of valve off, we will be motor off. So we got to change those values. But that's about it. That's all we have to do, because the hover, enter, and exit are the same. Similarly to the valve card behavior, we're going to duplicate that. And go to valve card behavior 2, which we just created, change the name to motor card behavior. And again, the listen messages also have to match the motor on and then motor off. So I'm selecting both listen messages and making sure the values for the channels match. Okay, now the thing is that we've created these 2 new motor behaviors, but we have not added them to the entities. So if I go to motor card, you notice how there's no state machine? All I need to do is drag the motor card behavior onto the motor card inspector panel. So now it's applied. Same thing for the motor hotspot. I need the motor hover action, or behavior, I'm sorry, from the assets panel, drag and dropped over here in the inspector panel, and then I go ahead and adds it. So instead of starting from scratch, we just duplicated, made some changes to the emit and then listen values, and now it's working. Okay, now let's play our scene and see what happens. Great, it's working. So we click on it. It grows, everything grows in size, including the cards. Click on it again, goes back down. Perfect. Okay, works the way we want it to work. In this final section of the video, we will add VR or virtual reality capabilities to our scene. To learn more about what VR platforms are supported by Sumerian, make sure that you visit the latest release notes. All right, so we've set up everything for the most part in our scene. The final thing we need to do is add some VR capabilities, which is actually a very simple thing to do. So let's go to Import Assets. This will open up the asset library. And if we just type in VR, there are two different asset packs. This core VR is one of the initial ones we set up, and we didn't remove it because customers might still be using it, but the VR asset pack is really the one you want to use. It's much more robust and a lot easier to use. So use the VR asset pack, and you'll see it populate down here in the asset panel. There's a lot of assets under the VR asset pack down here in the assets panel. The only three we really need to be worried about are these three scripts here at the top and the VR camera rig. So to bring VR into our scene, I'm just going to drag, remember the entity, that hexagon icon onto our scene. But it's going to place the VR camera rig in the middle of our air compressor, which we don't want to do. So let's move it back here, and we can move it over here a little bit more as well. Okay, so this is going to be the starting point when you jump into VR. It'll be right in this spot. And so wherever you want the user to actually be populated within the scene, that is where you want to place them in the VR camera rig entity. All right, we also want to select one thing, current VR camera rig. We just want to check that. So the VR camera rig is an entity. It also has a VR camera rig component. And the only thing you need to change again is just selecting that current VR camera rig. All right. So that is actually all you have to do to just add VR capabilities. But there are some other things you want to do if you want to be able to click on the air compressor, if you want to be able to hover on the hotspots, the annotated hotspots. There's a few more things. But in terms of, we could play this scene and jump into VR right now. But you also want to be able to move. Or teleport around. So there's a few things we need to do. Okay, so we've added the ability to be in VR, but we don't have the ability to teleport or move around the scene yet. To do that, what we need to do is select our floor entity. And then, so if you go down here in the assets panel, and I'll filter down to scripts, this sort of scroll-looking, scripty-looking icon, and you see how there's only scripts, and there's three here at the top, the teleport, grab, and activate. All I need to do to define the floor as something that can be moved upon, I just need to take that script and apply it to my floor. And now I've added VR to my scene, and now I can move about on the floor. And that'll give me, when I'm actually in VR, it'll give me these little teleport icons, little man or character icons that'll show up on something that I can teleport upon. So when I move my controller around on the floor, you'll be able to see and have a target of where you want to teleport to. Okay, so that is the floor. That's teleporting. Now we want to be able to do a few things. We want to be able to click on the air compressor and have it grow and shrink in size. So we want to be able to initiate that behavior, the scale behavior, and we also want to be able to hover on these as well and have them show and hide the annotation cards. So what do we need to do that? First, let's take the air compressor, and we want to take the VR action, the activate script. So we're not going to be doing anything with grab. We've already used teleport. We're not going to be using grab. The only other script we're going to be using is this activate script. There's a few ways to do this, by the way. You can add a component, add the script component, and then drag and drop that activate on that drop script input. Or I'll remove that script component. Or like I've been doing, you can just drag and drop the script onto the inspector panel, and that'll automatically apply that instance of the script as well as the script component. Okay, so on the air compressor, remember how we made it. Let's go to our behaviors. So the click behavior. The reason why we did it like this is that so we could you have a couple different uses for that, let me back up. The reason why we built these behaviors in such the way we did was that we want the air compressor to grow and shrink in size, but we want it to be able to respond not just to being clicked on with a mouse, but being clicked on using a VR controller. So to do that, we want it just to respond to messages. That's why we created a separate behavior that will emit a message that then initiates this scale behavior. We could have just done a click action here to then go scale up, and then a click action here, but then that would only limit it to clicking using a mouse. I wanted to be able to do it both for the mouse and the VR controllers. So that's why we set up two separate behaviors, so that when we go to the air compressor and you go to this VR action object, this activate script, the input drop-down menu, you can scroll down and do the on action button down, and then we can just define it to emit a message. If you remember that message that the very first message we used was just clicked. So remember, if you go to over this clicked behavior, the message is just clicked. So that's the same thing we're going to be doing here. We're not really doing, this script is really kind of creating like a built-in state machine that where it's a lot easier to actually control this, is that the button down, so when we point our controller at the air compressor, you'll have these little controllers with targets on it, and when you point it at the VR or at the air compressor and you click it, it'll emit that message. So that will then initiate the scale behavior to make it move and to scale up and down. Pretty simple. Okay, so that handles that one. Now we want to be able to hover on and off the hotspots to then show and hide those cards. So we'll go to the valve hotspot. We'll go down, we go back to our scripts, and again, just drag and drop the activate script on here. So for the input, we want to do on hover enter, and then the message we want to do is, or use, if you remember, is valve on. Okay, that handles the hover on, but we also need the other message, the hover off message that will be initiated, if you remember, which was valve off. So we take another activate script, apply another one, you can use it more than once, and we'll do the on hover exit. Valve off. So again, this is really a much simpler, easier way to do it that has just been built into this VR asset pack. Rather than creating your own behaviors, we've really just enabled you to add in these inputs and these values just very quickly and easily. So now it'll do the same thing as the mouse that we created using that behavior. And now we want to do the same thing to the valve, the motor hotspot. So we'll just do two instances of this real quickly. So we have two instances of the activate script. So the on hover enter, we'll do, and the message emitted will be hover or motor on. The exit, the on hover exit input will emit the message motor off. So now we've defined those hotspots to work both with VR and our desktop mouse, or if we want to use it on mobile, just tapping on it. So it can respond to multiple types of input. Okay, and so now we have created a VR scene that we can jump into VR. We can point our controller at the air compressor. We can grow it and shrink in size, and then we can hover on these hotspots to learn more about that. So if you wanted to learn about this valve and how it works, if this is a real life use case, real life application to where you want to learn about an air compressor, you hover on this hotspot and it pulls up an info card about that particular component of the machine. Same thing with this hotspot. Okay? And that is how you create a education and learning experience using Amazon Sumerian. Before we do anything else, what we should do is, if you want to publish this scene, you go to create public link. You go to publish. If you go to copy and paste it into a new tab, here we are. You can grow and shrink in size. And there we go. And if I had VR, I would be able to jump in. All right, that's it. And that's it for this video. Make sure you join our public Slack channel at slack.sumerian.world. Thanks for watching.